Welcome, everybody, to the second day of the 2021 Early Learner Forum. So grateful to have each and every one of you here with us today. I'm just going to remind everyone we're going to keep you all on mute, but if you would like to turn your cameras on, you are more than welcome to do so. Again, my name is Kayla Klein. I'm the director of Black Hills Reads campaign, which is an education initiative under the United Way of the Black Hills umbrella. I'm also the public policy chair for the statewide early learning South Dakota initiative and organizer of this event. Early Learner South Dakota's vision is that all children have access to high quality early learning experiences and environments to create a solid foundation for lifelong success, excuse me. As a reminder, all of these sessions will be recorded and available on the Early Learner YouTube channel. We also have recordings from yesterday's events available on the website where you clicked to join these sessions. All with the exception for the ACES trainings. We had one ACES training on yesterday. There will be another one on Monday, but those sessions will not be recorded. I would like to introduce our first speaker for this morning, Linda Smith. Linda Smith is the director of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Early Childhood Development Initiative. She most recently served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Early Childhood Development in the Administration for Children and Families, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. In this role, she provided overall policy coordination for Head Start and Early Head Start programs and the Child Care and Development Fund. She also served as the department's liaison to the U.S. Department of Education and other federal agencies. Previously, Linda served as the executive director for the National Association for the Child Care Resource and Referral Agencies, where she represented more than 650 community-based agencies concerned with the care of children in their earliest years. Key components of this entities included advocacy efforts, included strengthening childcare licensing and oversight, requiring comprehensive background checks, and establishing minimum training requirements for all childcare workers. Smith served as a legislative fellow and professional staffer on the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee under the chairmanship of the late Senator Edward M. Kennedy. Prior to this work, she was the director of the Office of Family Policy for the Secretary of Defense, where she was one of the primary architects of the military's child care program. Additionally, she held those positions with both the U.S. Army and U.S. Air Force. Smith began her career in early childhood education in Northern Cheyenne Reservation in her native state of Montana. She's a graduate from the University of Montana. Linda, thank you so much for being with us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Kayla, for having me. I just am excited to be here and to be speaking to people in South Dakota, actually a neighboring state from my home state of Montana. So I think we can go ahead with the slide presentation. What I want to do, first of all, is I want to start out by thanking Kayla and the United Way of the Black Hills for asking me to present here, because I think this is a very important topic and sometimes one that a lot of people really don't understand exactly the mechanics of this. So I'm going to spend the day talking about the business of childcare, what it is and why it matters. So if you go to the next slide, quickly, just a second on who the Bipartisan Policy Center is. We are a Washington, D.C. based think tank. I think we skipped a slide, but that's okay. Where what we do is seek to find the best ideas from both sides of the aisle. And we're going backwards the other way. Yeah. Anyway, we try to find the best ideas from both sides of the aisle to put forward public policy solutions that answer our country's most pressing problems. And I would say to you that right now, there's no more pressing problem than the issue around childcare and our economy. So if I just go over a slide that I think we missed in terms of the overview of what we're going to talk about today, the early years, the importance of them. Look at the basic business model and why the market is failing America's families. What we've learned from the COVID experience and how we can turn that knowledge into some action. the public good of childcare and why we need to rethink childcare in early education. And finally, to discuss a shared responsibility model and who's at the table and who's not. So as we move to the first slide here, these are things that I think generally people in this country agree to, that we know that we have the neuroscience now, and that generally everyone agrees on the importance of the birth to 5 years in the country. We have a lot of data and research. When I first started in this field, we, craved to see one study come out every few months and thought it was a great thing. And now we have just a lot of data and research available. I want to spend just a second on this one because sometimes people don't get this connection, but care and learning are inseparable. So when we say childcare is early learning. Whether or not it's good early learning is more the question, not if it is, but how good is it? And I think sometimes I still hear this, is it education or is it care? It's both, people. Anyone who's had any experience around an infant lately knows this. You've watched their little brains and they're just like sponges. So if they're in a bad childcare setting, we are setting the table for a whole host of problems down the road. So the quality of the care they get depends on the adult-child interactions. This is well researched and well documented, that the quality of those interactions is everything to a child. And that means the workforce is everything to a child, the teachers who interact with those children on a daily basis. So we know now that the childcare workforce is both undervalued and underpaid. And we're going to talk about what that pay looks like here in a second. But suffice it to say that if we want to have a high quality workforce, we're going to have to deal with that issue. It's well recognized that childcare is essential for most families in this country. Clearly, we'll see the data in a little while, but the majority of our parents, young parents, are in the workforce. Next thing is, and I think it's generally understood as well, that high quality childcare costs more than many of our families can afford. Public acceptance is also that there is a shortage of care in this country, that we simply don't have enough. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And finally, in early childhood and childcare in particular, parent choice is fundamentally an early childhood value, that we want a system of childcare that is based on parent care or parent choice. I say that too because I have my 2 children when they were younger, and I was actually running a center for the Air Force. My older daughter thrived in a group setting. My younger daughter was overwhelmed by it. And while I was even running a center, my youngest child was in a family childcare home. And people would say to me, well, don't you think your program's quality? Well, I sure did. But the issue wasn't my program. The issue was my child. And I think that's why parent choice is something that we have to pay attention to. We'll talk about that in a minute. So if we go to the next slide, we are going to ask you a question here that we would like your reaction to in polling. Do you agree or disagree with the statements that I just read? And if you disagree, we would appreciate you putting your answer into the chat on why you disagree with any of these statements, because it's pretty important that we have a common understanding of what childcare is in this country. And while you're typing in your answers, I want to mention one thing here, and that is that we see, when I use the term childcare, I mean that inclusive of all early childhood programs, whether it's part day preschools that are a nursery school kind of concept, childcare, full day, family childcare, all of it. We're talking about all of it when I refer to childcare here. So it looks like people generally agree with that statement. Haven't seen any disagreements yet, which is a good thing. This is, pretty much what the country writ large agrees to. So I think we can go forward now, or do we want to give them more time to respond?
I think we could probably move forward.
Okay, let's keep going with the next slide then. Okay, so what I want to do now is take some time to tell you, describe for you the national overview of childcare, the basics of it, and a little bit about how it works. So if we can go to the next slide, please. At the national level, this is what we have, and you can fill in the blank for South Dakota, but essentially there are 675,000 businesses. That was the number in 2016. Of those, about 75,000 were centers, and a huge number are family childcare homes, getting close to 600,000 of them are family childcare homes, small businesses run in people's homes. They are mostly women-owned businesses. The average size of our centers are essentially serve fewer than 50 children. So half of all centers serve fewer than 50 children, and a clear 68% serve fewer than 75. So they really are small businesses with, you know, basically, we're going to talk about this one in a second, with challenges of a small business and making ends meet. The annual revenue for all of childcare in the United States in 2016 was $47.2 billion. So if you go to the next slide. If you look at the childcare, you know, workforce, and basically the childcare employs roughly 2 million workers, evenly split between centers and family childcare homes. The points to be making here is that childcare, the workforce is aging. So respectively 26 and 38% are over age 50. This was particularly concerning during COVID, and the exposure issues of our workforce to the virus became a little bit challenging around the country. About half, and I think this surprises a lot of people, about half or have at least an AA degree or higher. So they're relatively well educated as a workforce. And I think most people don't understand that. We've made a lot of progress in early childhood in getting our workforce credentials up. We will talk about that more as this goes on, because we also know from what we're learning from the COVID experience is that we're losing a lot of that higher end trained workforce as these closures and some of these challenges continue into this next year. If you look at the female participation, close to 96% of the workforce is female. The average wage is $11.65 an hour nationally. I looked it up in South Dakota. It's lower than that. It's $10.55 according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So pretty poor wages for a workforce that's reasonably well qualified and educated. If you look at what that translates to in terms of poverty level, most of our childcare workers therefore are at poverty level wages. And that's what I think is really a challenge for our field. So if you think about this, half of all childcare workers in the United States are eligible for and enrolled in some kind of public assistance program. And by that, I mean things like food stamps and other supports that are offered through our public systems. Most lack benefits, including healthcare, and this was a challenge during COVID again, but still they were considered essential workers as the country faced closing down a lot of our businesses. So they're poorly paid, fairly well educated, and essential, but still living in poverty. And so the challenges of that and I guess the messages of that we're going to have to deal with. So if you go to the next slide, please, I want to talk a little bit about the child care need. If you look at what's going on nationally, roughly 66% of all children in this country under the age of 6 have all available parents in the workforce. So that means that roughly 2/3 of our children are in some kind of care for some part of the day. Still, only 30% of parents are actually paying for care. So the question that we're trying to examine in the work that we're doing is, where are the rest of the children, or why are their parents not paying for care? And we'll talk about that in a minute, because as we move through this, we have come to understand that so many of parents especially on the lower end of the wage scale, are literally priced out of childcare in this country. If you look at the average cost of care, and we put the ranges in here, essentially, the cost of infant care in the United States ranges from anywhere from $5,800 in Mississippi to $24,000 here in the District of Columbia. So that's a pretty, wide range, and a lot of factors that go into that in terms of the quality. For a 4-year-old, if you look at the ranges there, between $4,500 and $19,000, and DC takes the prize everywhere in terms of the cost. The proportion of family income spent on care in 2012, the last time we have data for this, was 20%. And there's no indication that that is changing. If not, it may be going up as we've continued to try to improve the wages of the workforce. So we're going to go forward now. And what the next question I'd like for people to weigh in on is this one. In your community, what is the biggest challenge, in terms of childcare? Lack of care, cost of care, the quality of care, the operating hours, or is it something else? And we're starting to get some people weighing in on that. Interesting that the lack of care is a significant thing in South Dakota. That is probably pretty consistent with, and I can point you all to some work we've been doing on mapping the gap for childcare across the country. We've actually looked at this, and the gap nationwide between what we have and what we need is roughly 32%. A clear third of the, of care, or of children don't have access to care in this country. Cost a factor, quality a factor, operating hours, anything, nobody did something else. Okay, so continuing on, I want to look now at the business of childcare, because I think this is where a lot of people don't understand the problems of what's going on with the market and why it is a struggle for childcare programs to even stay alive now because of the issues around COVID. But in any case, why this is such a fragile market. And I want to back up and say, I didn't say this in the intro, but let me say it now, that childcare here in Washington, D.C., at least at the federal level, is the one thing that consistently over the last several years has remained a bipartisan issue. That there is no, there are differences in ideas on how to fix the issue of childcare, but there is no question that we have a challenge with childcare and that we need to support it. And I think for some of us that it continues to be the good news. If you look at the history last year, in terms of where we had support for childcare, it was pretty much across the board. So I want to move on now and look at what the issues are around childcare. So looking at what we have is a market-based system of childcare. The market includes, as this shows, a diverse set of childcare arrangements, both for-profit and not-for-profit. And it includes a very diverse sources of funding. So anything from public, private, philanthropy, faith-based community, etc. The one thing we know about childcare is that it is labor intensive. So one of the points I try to make when I do this conversation with people is that as in any business, there is both a supply as well as a demand side of the equation. And this is where we struggle, because when it simply costs more to produce a product in any business, let alone childcare, the business will fail if the customer can't afford it. And so what we have in the United States is a product that costs more than parents can afford. And that's why childcare as a business model is failing our communities right now. And if you go back to the cost of care and the lack of care, those are real serious issues for this country. So if we go to the next slide and we look at the business model and the demand side of the equation. So this is where parents come in. They are the demand side, they are the purchasers of care in this system. So I think we skipped one here. No, go out to the next, I'm sorry, the next slide, please. Yeah. So what we have here is that most of the attention, the public attention on childcare until very recently has focused almost entirely on parents and the demand side of the business model. So we've all heard about the cost of care. Going back to the first slide, everyone pretty much agrees that it costs more than a lot of parents can pay. That there's a lack of care primarily for infants in this country. That's fairly well recognized. But what we have not focused on is why these things exist in this country. Why does it cost so much? Why can't parents afford it, etc.? So there are two major sources of revenue for the child care programs in the country. First one is public vouchers, and they come funded primarily through the Child Care Development Block Grant and TANF. And I know that South Dakota got CARES dollars to help with this situation during the COVID experience. It just got an increase in that money very recently. So that money is the one source of income to these programs. The other source is what comes from private pay, or those parents who don't qualify for any assistance and pay the full share themselves. So what we have then in effect is a demand side equation where a lot of this demand is basically, or the demand, the supply can't meet that demand because of the cost. So I put a point down here that the federal and state governments are the biggest single purchaser of care in this country. And that is something that has to be factored in, because it is one of the reasons when we look at how states set their rates of reimbursement for childcare programs, they're generally well below what the actual cost of care is. And so I know that there's a requirement in the CCDBG that states conduct a market survey. There is also an option for the states to do a cost of care model. And I need to go on to the next slide, please. So what this is saying essentially is that government policies have enormous influence on the market. And when the state sets the reimbursement rate at much lower than the cost of care, what it's doing is undermining the quality for all families, not just for subsidy families. And so we really have got to think about how we do it. We are, where I am now trying to help states understand that they have the option to do a cost of care model rather than a market rate survey, and that we really need to start focusing on the cost and setting the rates of reimbursement more in line with the cost, which then allows the providers to pay their people more money. So if we go on to the next slide, please. The other side, the other issue with the demand side of the equation is the instability of basically the income going into our childcare programs. And I have dealt with this my whole life. When I used to run a program, parents, for example, will say to you, I don't want to pay if my child's not there. But the problem is the workforce still has to get paid, the lights still have to get paid, the rent still has to get paid. And so where there's an issue, and we all understand parents have, some concerns about that, that's a really destabilizer for childcare. The other piece is that the parents' need for care changes. And so when their work hours change, their need for care changes, and everything gets, turned upside down. Their preferences change over time. We see parents, the older a child gets, the more they want their children in some kind of a center-based program where they have social emotional development and other things. And then we also see where their ability to pay changes. And the other thing, and you've heard of this, the cliff effect, where especially our subsidy parents, if they earn 10 cents more an hour, then they lose their subsidy. And so we have that to deal with. So as a result of all of this instability, coming from the demand side of the equation, childcare directors are reluctant to raise the pay of the teachers because the parent may leave tomorrow. They may, and when they do, they take there goes the income. So the next slide, please, is another one of these survey questions we want to ask you. In South Dakota, what is the biggest factor influencing parent choice? Is it the cost of the program, the location, the availability, trust we hear a lot about, or something else? And we're looking at the 60% saying the cost. I see this issue around trust and availability. Trust, as we've done work around the country, we've done a number of focus groups with families around the country. And the number one thing that pops out when the first thing you ask a parent, what's the biggest concern you have? And it's trust. They are very concerned about trusting their childcare providers, and our early childhood community and childcare in particular needs to do a better job of helping parents understand, sort of why they should be trusted. The cost, obviously, in South Dakota is a big issue, with 2/3 saying the cost is the number one barrier. That's pretty consistent with other things that we've learned as well. I'm just going to keep going on to the next, if we can. Okay, so the failing business model. Now we're going to look at the supply side of this equation when it comes to the business of childcare. Essentially, childcare it's a pretty simple model in that it's almost all labor. In addition to that, we have fixed costs, which are rent, utilities, lights, etc. But the labor costs are what are the cost driver in these programs. And that's why it is so hard to get the costs down for parents, because there's not much flexibility there. So if you look at child ratios, the ages of children served in the programs, their enrollment, and then the wages paid. So what I've done in this little box on the side is give you just a really high level look at why it costs so much if teachers are so poorly paid. So if you look at, generally speaking, in the United States, the ratio is 1:4 for infants in a childcare center. Generally, that's what it is. The hours of operation generally are somewhere around 12 hours a day. So that means that teacher wages are not just based on an 8-hour day, they're based on a day, a day and a half, so to speak. So it's not like we can just say, well, 8 hours a day, here's the cost. So the teacher wages for hours based on the average pay of what I showed you earlier, the wages alone would be, in this scenario, $180. The infant rate of pay generally in a lot of places is $43. That's the averages of what states are reimbursing in terms of childcare. So assuming full enrollment, which it almost never is in a childcare program, you've got a loss before you even start. Think about it. So that's in one way, that's why most programs don't take infants, because the cost of doing this is so high. So if you think you open the door and you're losing money, there's a good reason, not to provide the care that so many of our families are looking for. So if we keep going here to the next slide. So balancing the income and the expenses in childcare is a constant challenge for our childcare programs of any kind. So most points, the first point I think to make is that most programs don't operate at 100% capacity. Generally speaking, they're somewhere between in the 80s if they're operating. And I think that's true of most of the bigger chains, at least, and a lot of smaller mom and pops have it, there's always a lag time when somebody leaves before you fill the space. So they're not operating at 100%. And what we've come to understand during the COVID experience, and most programs in this country are operating at somewhere between 50 and 60%. So you think that what that has done to the income of the program and why they're struggling when you've just cut their enrollment basically in half. Parents resist pain when their children aren't present. I talked about that earlier. And then we have this other phenomenon in our country where the 3 and 4-year-olds have traditionally offset the cost of care for the infants and toddlers. But as the country has gone to more and more pre-K programs that are financed publicly in our schools, they take those 4-year-olds out, and that pushes the cost down to, and there's no offset. So I liken this whole situation to a balloon. And if you look at a balloon and you think about, you squeeze it. So let's say we want to raise the wages. So we raise the wages of the workforce. Well, where does that pop out? Well, it pops out, we have to charge the parents more because there's no other place to go. So you think about these things, everything has a consequence to it. And it isn't as simple as let's just raise the wages, because we all know the workforce needs to be paid more. But where is the money going to come from? So let's go on to the next slide here and look at what we've learned from COVID. And this is where I think we have made real progress with here in Washington and Congress. If Congress understands this better than I think a lot of the country does right now. They understand that the market approach is failing childcare right now, that the instability and the fragile nature of childcare has caused us to lose a lot of our capacity around the country. They get that the profit margin, they're just too thin to make a profit, and they don't allow for these programs to have any reserves. So we hear a lot here in Washington, and I'd be curious as to what you're hearing in South Dakota, is a lot of our smaller operators are actually borrowing on their credit cards to stay open, taking loans on their IRAs. They're doing a whole number of things to try and make it through this situation. But that we really have that fragile of a market right now. And I would say also that fragile nature and the lack of reserves has really impacted the closure rates in this country. We know nationally that we've lost at least 11% of our capacity permanently, and that a significant number of our programs are still closed in the 30%, mostly the smaller ones that are barely hanging on here. The other thing that we know from COVID and that we have lost, as I said earlier, are a lot of our staff. We've got at least a 20%, if not 25% loss in the staff, the teachers in our programs. And we don't know if they're going to come back. And if they're not coming back, we're replacing them with less skilled, less trained workers who, as I was telling someone earlier, what we know is going on right now is that we have parents that are stressed out, we have children that are stressed out, and we have teachers that are stressed out. And if they're not trained to manage some of the challenging behaviors of children, and we have set our childcare, early childhood community up for some serious challenges and issues. So what have we learned? And you would probably saw this in the last package that passed Congress for the $10 billion, was that the use of grants and contracts to try and stabilize the supply has become paramount here in sort of the discussion before Congress. And there've been a number of different things introduced here in Washington to address this instability of care issue. One of the questions is this a short-term or a long-term issue? And I would say that it's a long-term issue, and it's our job here, as well as you in the States, to help people understand that the COVID experience has only exposed what we've known for a long time, which is the business model doesn't really work. And we're going to have to deal with that and address it. So we do need a longer term and a balanced financing strategy for, looking at the supply side of the equation. And as I said earlier, remember that most of the focus in the country has been on the demand side through the vouchers and certificates, which we totally need, but we also need now to think about what we're doing to these small businesses, mostly women-owned businesses, and how we're going to provide more of a balanced approach to this. So what we've learned, if you go to the next slide, is that childcare has impacted the demand and the supply for care. Looking at how many programs, what's closed, what's open, etc. You can see here that the demand for care has gone down, and we're probably not going to see that come back, we don't think, full steam until the end of this next year, the year we're in, 2021. That parents, if you want to go and look at a survey we just did, we finished a survey in December, we posted it last Friday. It looked at some of the issues that parents are looking for in terms of returning to putting their children back in childcare programs. A lot of emphasis on getting the vaccine out there before they're going to be comfortable with putting their kids back in care. But the numbers of programs that are closed or have restricted operating hours is significant. So the potential, the supply side of the equation has definitely been impacted. If you go to the next slide, please. Next slide, yeah. Okay, I think kind of got, let me see here. I'm just looking here at some of what we found in our most recent survey in terms of what parents were looking for in care. It shows you here the importance that parents play or place on the cleanliness and the prevention of illnesses. And that's no surprise, but I will say that this is not new either. If you talk to parents, they talk about trust, health, and safety of children as their primary things that they are looking for. How many of them are caring for their own children now because of the pandemic? One of the things that was of interest to us is that the issue around the faith-based childcare centers and the, what parents really want and how they're using that. And then the ideal, what parents were saying to us, and all this data is in our survey work posted on our website, but how many parents really want and think that their ideal arrangement is caring for their own children right now. And the stress that that's also placing on parents and families to get through this. So one of the things that all this said to us in trying to summarize the fact that this equation is not balanced and that we have a disconnect between parents and what parents want and can afford and the supply and what it costs to do it. We, during this COVID experience, have come to understand that there really is a public good aspect of childcare. In order to get our businesses back up and running, our parents back to work, we have got to deal with some of the issues around childcare and why it is not working. Now, what we've been trying to say here in Washington to Congress is that this is not a short-term issue, that we've got to deal with the instability of this market long-term. So if we can go forward to the next slide, please. So I'm curious as to whether or not the people on this call think that childcare there is a public good aspect to childcare. And if you don't, if you could tell us why you don't. We're just looking at the responses here. So far, there's not anyone who doesn't agree that there's a public good to it, and I think that's one of the good things that we've learned lately out of the COVID experience.
Linda, I just got a message from someone in the chat that they're actually not seeing the polling results. Sorry about that, folks, if you aren't. We'll try to recap what they were as they come through, but the majority, actually everyone, answered yes to this last question.
It was 100%, and that's really good to know. I mean, seriously, that has been an issue of discussion, but I think more and more people are beginning to understand that there is something that the public should do to invest in this. So let's keep going to the next slide. So the next thing, what we're trying to do, or want to put on the table right now, is that we know nationally that there is a lack of childcare, and that the gap cannot be solved without addressing the business model between, as I say, what it costs to provide the care and what parents can pay. One of the points that I try to make when I talk to a state or even a community about this is that the solutions lie at both the community level with the support of state and federal policymakers. So for example, the CARES dollars that went out to support the program, I think we needed to make those investments. But beyond those investments, what are the solutions? Why there was a discussion earlier about the gap in access. What is causing the access problems within your community? I did a similar presentation for Nebraska not too long ago, and one of the things that came up in that was the difference between one community to another. So in one community, the community had a business that worked shift work. Okay, so they needed irregular time, irregular duty, whatever you want to call it, non-traditional hours care. The next county over didn't have that, so they didn't need it. And these things are things that can only be determined at the community level. So what is the need for care? What is the gap in your communities in South Dakota? And then once you have figured that out, then you begin to put together the solutions for what will work for your county. We've done a lot of work around the country. There are very innovative things going on around this country in terms of once you know what the gap is, then how do you fix it? I was back in Montana earlier in last year, Missoula, Montana, town I used to live in, by the way, but also a small city for Montana, but they had a complete lack of infant care. And so the community got together with the public school system. They took a closed elementary school, and the community, with the help of the Chamber of Commerce, the government, the county, they are renovating a school to provide only infant care for that city. So I think that's where, no one in Washington can say what to do there. No one even at the state level can tell that community what needs to be done. So, but it's a partnership between everyone that made that happen. The community with the support of the state and the use of some of the federal funds in terms of the CCDF, they were able to come together and make that happen. So it also takes leadership. And that's where we talk about moving from understanding what the problem is to solutions. And again, that we can do the national data, as you've seen me present here today, but you have got to do this both for South Dakota, and you've got to do this for your communities. So what is your supply in any one of your communities in South Dakota? Where are the gaps? If you go to, we have a website called childcaregap.org, and you can go, we've mapped, I think now, well, there's 25 on the map right now, but we just finished 30 states where we're looking at the supply of care versus the potential need of care. We can narrow that down to a county level, to a city level, to congressional districts, etc. But it's meant to help communities understand their gap. Okay. And I think this is something that South Dakota needs to do to understand the gap before you start to plan for what's your need. You heard people where Kayla, when she gave my bio, when I worked for the military for don't want to say how many years because it'll really date me, but when I worked for the military, one of the things that Congress asked us to do was to determine how much care we needed so that we would know how to fix it. We still don't know nationally how much care we need, but it's hard to go to a legislature and say, we need childcare without knowing how much you need. So some of these, filling in these gaps in terms of where you have it and where you don't, become paramount in moving the policy debate forward. Some of that takes leadership at the state, some of it takes leadership at the local level. I want to put a pin in this one because those who benefit from high quality care should be a part of the solution. So who benefits in your communities? I would say that we know nationally that education, that our schools benefit from good early education. Our kids come to school ready to learn, that we're not doing as much remedial education as we can. And we've all seen the 30 million word gap research about how many kids fall behind by the time they're 3. We can fix some of this with, quality early child care. So that's one thing. The education community benefits from it. They should be a part of a solution. Business definitely benefits. Businesses can't go, they have a hard time operating without their workforce having childcare. So businesses benefit from it. I added another one to my sort of who benefits group is our court system and our prison system benefit, because we pay so much, and we all know this, so much to keep someone in prison. If we'd invest half of that in early childhood, we could prevent so much of that. I was on a call yesterday with someone from the court system down in Houston, Texas, and they're taking this on. The courts are taking it on because they see the connection. So there are a number of people who do who benefit. So next slide, who's missing in your community from the conversation? This is not one size, fits all, but there are a number of people who benefit from this, including government, economic, so forth and so on. We do have some models to look at in this country. We've got the military model, which you heard talked about, the early Head Start child care partnerships. We've got a shared value that we can build on, all those things that we started out with, people agree to. So what we really need in this country is an actionable plan for how we're going to move forward with this. And again, that can only happen at the local level. So I think we should probably move now to questions from you all, to see what questions you have, comments you have, what I've said doesn't make sense, what you would challenge. So if we could open it up, Kayla, to questions.
Yeah, please, and anyone who has some additional questions for Linda, feel free to put them in the chat, or also we'll be watching for folks coming off mute. If you would like to just ask your question, you are more than welcome to do so. And while I'm waiting for folks to ask some questions, we did have, I wanted to make sure I let everyone know, I put Linda's direct link to the Bipartisan Policy Center in the chat, and I also put that childcare gap link that she referenced in the chat as well. Mm-hmm. And so I feel, Linda, listening to you, it does sound that we do need to do some work in finding what the gap is in order to really understand the issue. And Early Learner South Dakota is starting to work on some of that. But again, it's kind of a slow process. Mm-hmm. Noticing that you do have this gap, what are there recommendations you would make to South Dakota in starting that work? Is there, somewhere or somehow we can get involved in order to, work on finding that information out? What are your recommendations?
Well, the one thing, and I would offer this up to South Dakota, my heart's in the West, you guys. I'll say that just out there because I am a native of Montana and I feel I'll always be a native of the West. And I would love if, we could help South Dakota with mapping your gap similar to what you saw on that. If you can go to our child care gap website, you'll see what we've done. Happy to do that with South Dakota. And I think Kayla, we've talked a little bit about that and getting ready for this, because I think it would help to understand where you have challenges. We've done a lot of work looking. There are special situations with rural areas. I tell people this, you said I started my career actually in early childhood on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in eastern Montana. We were 130 miles from Billings, and I get rural. But the one thing I would say is, so what are the challenges of rural parts of your state, and what are possible solutions to them? Because I hear people say a lot when we talk about this gap issue, well, we can't afford a center. Well, my first center was for 25 children. Now I get that it's a costlier model. Yes, but if you understand it, it isn't that you can't have one, it's you have to be willing to pay for one. And that's where I disagree with, well, it's not possible to have childcare centers in rural parts of the country. That was a really small part of Montana down there in that southeastern part. We made it work in part because we pieced together funding from the tribe, from St. Lebre Indian School, which is down there. We had a number and we got a grant. So how you piece together some of these things, but don't say no to any option. I think that's where we've got to stop. We would be happy to help you with mapping the gap in South Dakota if you think that would work for you guys. But I think that it's an important piece of the equation is to understand where you have problems before you figure out what the solution is.
Right. And for those on the call, to go back to what Linda first mentioned, is that with Early Learner South Dakota, I believe, especially after this forum, we're going to be connecting more with Linda in order to work with her and see if we could help along with our efforts that we're already taking in partnership with the state at the state level. So there's been a few questions that have come around workforce. And of course, there had just been some comments in the chat about Teach or the childcare wage program. What are some ways that we can help support our workforce in the state? And maybe do you have examples of successful examples from other states?
Mm-hmm. I think what we're learning, as I said, one of the things we're learning from the COVID experience is that as I said, we need a supply side strategy here. How do we get stable funding into childcare programs that then allow people to raise those wages? If I were a childcare director right now and somebody said, well, give me a pay raise, but I wasn't sure tomorrow I was going to have any kids, I would say, ooh, don't think I can go there. So how does that happen? And I think what we've learned with COVID is by a combination of grants and contracts to programs that stabilize the supply side of the equation while still allowing parents to have choices. And so and I think there are a number of states right now that are looking at how do they get grants into these programs. Contracts are an allowable use of CCDF funds. So can you figure out a strategy that helps balance that? There aren't that many states that were using grants and contracts prior to COVID, and I think you're going to see that tick up significantly. So if you can figure out how to get, let's say, one of the things that we've been talking about in terms of our work lessons learned from COVID is, can we come up with a supply side strategy of where there's public dollars that go into the supply to stabilize it? Let's just say if we could pay for 25% of the supply, the fixed costs of childcare, then that allows what that money would, that provider can take that money and pay the workers more, the teachers more. So I think what we're going to have to do is try to begin to have these conversations about that balance, and however that is. If you go back to the military model, which I'm most familiar with, that was exactly what the military did. In the military model, the Congress told us we had to basically create a scenario where it was 50-50 shared responsibility. Getting back to that, do we have a shared responsibility? In the military, we did. So they said, okay, so dollar for dollar, you will match parent fees with public funds. Okay, 50-50 split. The dollar of public funds went to the programs, and in return for that money, paid the wages of the workforce so that the parents did not have to pay the increased wages. All right, if you're with me on that. And we're just finishing up a little short video of the military model and why it worked. But again, we put our dollars into the programs. The parents could choose between those programs. They still took their private pay dollars to the center, to the part-day preschool, to the family child care home, whatever it was. But that there was a level of quality in those programs because the money was there to pay the workers. Okay. So I think that's the kind of thinking we're going to have to do. Maybe that model won't work exactly in the private sector, but some version of it might, to where we get those grants in. I think only 92% of all the money going into childcare through the federal funds, state funds, is through the certificate side. Only 8% contracts. Can we think about how we balance that?
So it sounds like, and I know there's even some more questions coming through, how do we support the directors of programs and things like that too. But it sounds like by what you're saying is that a majority of this needs to come from the money coming in through the state already that can supplement the private pay dollars.
Yes.
Essentially.
That is pretty much what I'm saying. That gets back to, do we think there's a public responsibility or a shared responsibility for childcare? And it goes also back to who benefits from it. So if our public school system benefits from it, our businesses benefit from it, our court systems benefit from it. So where is the public sector responsibility for this? I'm not saying it should be 100%. But I am saying there needs to be a shared responsibility between our public and our private sectors. And if we could come to that kind of a model, we could help support these programs and make them viable.
And then there was another, and maybe that's something we can also work with you on with Early Learner South Dakota. I know a lot of our work deals with educating our legislators and other elected officials in order to make some of that happen. So I would encourage everyone on the call to continue to follow Early Learner South Dakota and our updates. I had another question in the chat. Will the video for the military model be available to us to watch when it is done?
Absolutely. Yeah, as soon as we get it, I'll make sure you guys get it, okay? It's a short video, but it explains the model a little bit more and what we are trying to think through at where I am right now at BPC. And to try and figure out the sort of how we fill this gap. There's a real interesting thing in here, and I do think that this is something that we're dealing with. I see this in the chat from Kevin, in terms of this belief that if we can go back to the days when women just stayed home and take care of the kids. It's interesting that you still have that sort of thinking, and I think there's some of it out there around the country. I would say this is where Congress has really changed. We used to deal with that with the members of Congress all the time. Women just stay home and take care of the kids. Well, guess what? Businesses, and this is where you need to engage your business community, because businesses cannot lose the women that they have in their workforce. Right now, they are such a part of an interwoven part of the workforce, the fabric of our country now, that to suggest that all women would stop working and stay home is not going to happen. And I think the more your business community makes that connection to those people in power in your state government, that will help, because I know that they've got to be there. There've got to be businesses that would not be able to function without women. And even at the federal level, one of the biggest topics that we're struggling with is the fact of so many women leaving the workforce at twice the rate of men in this country, and the fact that businesses are struggling right now to figure out what to do about it.
I would agree with that. And we do even have a lot of that on the website with the take action link was one of the last links I put out there. Also, we have a statewide advocates email distribution list. If you want to be added to that, please email me. I put my email in the chat and the info@earlylearnersd.org. We always like to remind people that in South Dakota, it may seem odd, but Congress is going at a much quicker speed than our state. And yeah, who knew, right? They might be help us shift this change, and Early Learner South Dakota is constantly staying up to speed and helping to inform elected officials around the state. So please stay involved if you'd like. I know we're right at 11 o'clock, but Linda, I wanted to make sure you didn't have any other closing statements or things you wanted to make sure everyone on the call heard.
No, I think that, you know, in closing this out, I think what we really are struggling with is that we just have got to collectively, as a nation, figure out what we're going to do with this problem. And it is not a short-term problem. It is a long-term problem. It is going to stay with us. I think there are a number of solutions, but we're going to have to get creative. And it's not one size fits all. Having come and lived in rural parts of this country, I get that. So I think what we need is all hands on deck, folks, to figure out what we're going to do for this birth to 5 population of children. Because if you go back to those assumptions, the science is clear, we need it, the brain development is there, it is a critical time for our families and our children, and we can do better than this in this country. I know we can. So I think that'd be my closing remarks. And I think if anybody has questions, you can email them to me, and happy to help in any way. We got a ton of stuff on our website in looking at this issue. Final thing I would say about BPC before I let it go is that we are truly bipartisan. We never go anywhere that's not in a bipartisan manner. So just in case anybody has that question. So we try, as I said, to take the ideas from both sides of the aisle to make something happen in this country. So I would want to thank everyone who got on this call. I didn't get to see a lot of you. Usually we'd be in a room where we could have eye contact, and I would someday love to see you all. So thank you, Kayla, very much for having me.
Yes, thank you, Linda. And everyone, I did put Linda's contact information in the chat just now. So if you would like to communicate with her, please feel free to take her email there. Linda, thank you so much again for joining us today. And again, just as a reminder, everyone, that we do have our next presentation. You do have to click on a separate click here to join link on the website that Ty has created. It will start at 12:45 Central, 11:45 Mountain. I put the site in the chat if you need to go there, but if as soon as you click the here to join, you will get an email with the Zoom link and all of that additional information. This recording will be available tomorrow on that website as well if you have someone who missed the presentation today. So remember, again, in about 45 minutes, we have our next presentation from the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. So thank you guys so much. Linda, thank you again. And I hope you guys all have a wonderful, wonderful day. Hope to see you at the next presentation.
Thank you.
Bye.